Well, Gunung Padang is an extraordinary site. Yeah, it's multiple layers of cultures, pyramids, since 20th, since the Ice Age.
A retracted scientific paper is not supposed to come back to life. But underneath a quiet hillside in West Java, that is precisely what's happening right now, and the researchers at the center of it refuse to let the story end where their critics wanted it to. In March 2024, the journal Archaeological Prospection formally retracted one of the most explosive archaeological claims of the decade, a paper arguing that a hill called Gunung Padang concealed a buried pyramid up to 27,000 years old, a structure that would have made it older than Göbekli Tepe, older than Stonehenge, older than every pyramid in Egypt put together. The retraction should have been the final word. Instead, new fieldwork, renewed government interest, and a research team that never stopped digging have pulled the debate back into the light, and this time the questions being asked are sharper than before. To understand why this hillside refuses to fade from the headlines, you have to start with what everyone, on every side of this argument, actually agrees on. Gunung Padang sits roughly 885 meters above sea level in Cianjur Regency, West Java, built on the slopes of a long-extinct volcano. 5 stone terraces climb the hillside, connected by a staircase of around 370 steps, covering more than 3 hectares of retaining walls, platforms, and pathways made from naturally hexagonal andesite and basalt columns, the same kind of volcanic rock that forms the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. Archaeologists classify the visible monument as a Punden Berundak, a traditional Indonesian stepped terrace sanctuary tied to ancestor worship, a style found at other sites across the archipelago. Local Sundanese communities have treated the hill as sacred for generations, with folklore describing a legendary king who tried and failed to build a palace there in a single night. None of that is disputed. What's built into the surface of Gunung Padang is real, verified, walkable archaeology. The controversy was never about what sits on top of the hill. It's about what might be buried inside it. That question first took shape more than a decade ago, when geologist Danny Hillman Natawajaja, affiliated with Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency, began leading a team that would eventually include archaeologists, architects, philologists, and astronomers. Natawajaja's interest in the site predates his most famous paper by years. Roughly a decade before that publication, his early claims about the hill had already caught the attention of then-President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who set up a government task force to investigate, with Natawajaja himself as a member. That kind of presidential-level attention gave the research an unusual public weight from the very beginning, which is part of why, when the eventual findings went public, they landed as a national story rather than a quiet, academic one. Between 2011 and 2014, the team used ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and seismic tomography to map what lay beneath the visible terraces, backing up every scan with physical core drilling to check the readings against real rock and soil. None of these are fringe tools. They're standard instruments in mainstream geology and civil engineering, used precisely because they let researchers see underground before committing to a full excavation. What the surveys revealed was a hill that wasn't uniform. It appeared to contain distinct underground layers, each with different density, different electrical resistance, different seismic behavior, arranged like pages in a book nobody had actually opened yet. The team organized this into 4 proposed units. Unit 1 was the visible terraces everyone already knew. Unit 2 described buried stone arrangements just beneath the surface. Unit 3 pointed to deeper formations that the team argued showed signs of deliberate shaping. And Unit 4 reached deep into the hill's natural volcanic core, a layer the researchers argued had itself been partially worked by human hands before anything was built on top of it. In October 2023, Natawajaja and 11 co-authors published these findings, arguing that the deepest layers weren't natural at all, that they were the remains of an intentionally shaped structure, built, buried, and built upon again across a staggering span of time. The paper dated Unit 2 to roughly 6,000 to 5,500 BCE, broadly in line with earlier estimates for the site. But Unit 3, the deepest and most contested layer, was dated to somewhere between 25,000 and 14,000 BCE. That range is what produced the headlines. It placed Mount Padang's oldest construction phase at more than twice the age of Göbekli Tepe, 5 times older than Stonehenge, and tens of thousands of years before Egypt's earliest pyramid at Saqqara. If the numbers held, this wouldn't just be an important archaeological site. It would be, by a staggering margin, the oldest known example of monumental construction on Earth. Older than farming, older than writing, older than the wheel itself. One detail added extra fuel to an already blazing story. British author Graham Hancock, the host of Netflix's Ancient Apocalypse and a longtime proponent of a lost advanced Ice Age civilization, was publicly thanked in the paper's acknowledgments for proofreading the manuscript before submission. He wasn't a co-author and held no formal research role, but the connection was enough to put mainstream archaeologists, many already skeptical of Hancock's work, on alert before they'd finished reading the data. Gunung Padang had already appeared prominently in the first episode of Hancock's series a year before the paper was even published, meaning a massive global audience had absorbed the ancient pyramid framing long before a single peer-reviewed word existed to support it. The backlash that followed wasn't reflexive gatekeeping. It was specific, technical, and it came from multiple countries at once. Flint Dibble, an archaeologist at Cardiff University, told the journal Nature he was surprised the paper had been published in its original form, arguing that while the underlying data was legitimate, the conclusions drawn from it weren't. He questioned whether the deep material was man-made at all, noting there were no visible tool marks, and that naturally shifting volcanic rubble can settle into patterns that look deliberately organized after tens of thousands of years of erosion, no human hands required. Bill Farley, an archaeologist at Southern Connecticut State University, focused on the dating itself, pointing out there is no established evidence of human settlement anywhere in the region during that window of the last ice age. Even genuinely ancient soil, he argued, doesn't carry the hallmarks archaeologists need: charcoal, bone fragments, worked tools, before it can be attributed to human construction rather than ordinary geology. Crucially, this wasn't outside skeptics against Indonesian researchers. Indonesian archaeologists raised their own objections just as forcefully. Harry Truman Simanjuntak was blunt, describing the pyramid interpretation as the kind of conclusion reached when someone goes looking for evidence to fit a predetermined idea, rather than letting the data speak first. Helena Bonet, an archaeologist at Humboldt University in Berlin who has conducted fieldwork in Indonesia, pointed to ceramic evidence from the site's upper layers suggesting human activity as early as the 12th or 13th century, while noting that anything older simply hasn't left behind material that can be reliably dated. Their combined objections came down to a few connected problems. Radiocarbon dating measures the age of organic material, not necessarily the age of anything built around it. The extreme ages in the paper came from soil samples, not from hearths, tools, or other features with a demonstrated link to human activity. Separately, many geologists argued that the deep layers detected by radar and resistivity could be explained entirely by natural volcanic processes, fractured lava and naturally occurring columnar jointing, the same geological phenomenon behind famous formations elsewhere in the world. And if humans truly built something monumental 25,000 years ago, critics expected to find tools, occupation debris, or cultural material at that depth, the kind of evidence found at every other confirmed prehistoric construction site on Earth. For Mount Padang's deepest proposed phase, that evidence was essentially absent. Within weeks, the journal launched a formal review that unfolded over roughly 3 months of correspondence between editors and the lead author. In March 2024, co-editors-in-chief Eileen Ernenwine and Gregory Schrock, alongside publisher Wiley, issued the retraction, stating specifically that the radiocarbon dating had been applied to soil samples with no demonstrated connection to human activity, and that this gap had slipped through peer review undetected. But the authors did not accept it quietly. Nata Wajaja and his co-authors submitted a formal rebuttal, arguing that the retraction focused narrowly on the radiocarbon issue while setting aside more than a decade of geophysical surveys, drilling, and trenching that in their view still pointed towards something worth investigating further. The editors were not persuaded, and the retraction stood. But Nata Wajaja kept working, and he began inviting outside researchers to visit the site and study it independently, treating the question as open rather than closed. That's where things stood until recently, when new movement began. According to reporting on the renewed effort, Indonesia's newly appointed Minister of Culture has signaled support for continuing the research, with the team hoping for updated funding and access within the coming months. No new radiocarbon dates have yet been published, which means the core scientific gap that triggered the retraction hasn't technically been closed. But a landslide exposure uncovered during the original fieldwork revealed cuts in the stone that the team argues look too precise to be natural, evidence they say deserves a second, more rigorous look rather than dismissal. Some Indonesian researchers have also pushed to reframe the entire conversation, arguing the site should be understood not as a failed pyramid claim but as what it was always most likely to be, a punden, a stepped ceremonial sanctuary, genuinely old and genuinely significant without requiring an Ice Age civilization to justify continued study. Coverage by outlets including the New York Times noted an additional layer to all of this, the idea that some of the public enthusiasm inside Indonesia became tangled with a sense of national pride, the possibility that the country might be home to the single oldest monument on Earth carrying emotional weight that reached well beyond the archaeology itself. That doesn't make the underlying data wrong. But it helps explain why this story generated so much heat on every side, and why neither the original claim nor its retraction has managed to fully settle the argument. Strip away the headlines and the two camps agree on more than you'd expect. Nobody disputes that Mount Padang is a genuine, significant archaeological site, built by skilled people, serving a real ceremonial purpose that local communities still honor. Nobody disputes that much of the hill has never been excavated by hand using traditional methods. And nobody disputes that the original geophysical surveys revealed something layered and complex beneath the surface, raw data that was never retracted along with the paper's conclusions. What remains unresolved is what that layering actually represents: deliberate construction spanning tens of thousands of years, or a naturally stratified volcanic hill that people later built on top of using stone the landscape had already provided. There is no comfortable middle ground here. Mount Padang either rewrites the opening chapter of human history, or it doesn't. Right now, nobody has done the excavation work required to say which. Closing that gap will take wide, methodical trenches rather than narrow drill cores, stratigraphy documented clearly enough to separate volcanic layers from human ones beyond reasonable doubt, and dating tied directly to unmistakably human material, tools, hearths, worked stone bearing visible marks, not soil that could have accumulated for entirely unrelated reasons. It will also take independent teams with no stake in the outcome, examining the same ground and reaching their own conclusions. A retraction, in the end, is not necessarily the end of a scientific question. It's a correction to a set of conclusions that outran the evidence supporting them. The data collected over more than a decade of fieldwork still exists, still waiting for someone to test it properly. There is something quietly moving about a mystery that refuses the easy ending. Most stories like this resolve one way or another, proven or debunked, and the world moves on. Mount Padang hasn't given anyone that comfort. Somewhere beneath that hillside in West Java sits a layer of stone that has been scanned, drilled, argued over, retracted, and reopened, and still nobody can say with certainty what it is. Maybe it's simply a beautifully preserved ceremonial monument built by ordinary, skilled people a few thousand years ago, exactly the kind of site archaeologists already understand. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something that forces us to reconsider how early humans were capable of building at all. Until someone puts a shovel exactly where it needs to go, both possibilities stay alive, and so does the hill's quiet hold over everyone who has ever stood on its terraces asking what's underneath their feet.